Officer, what exactly are we being accused of?
Suspicious behavior. Don't argue with me.
We've done nothing wrong. This is profiling.
Put the phone away or I'll remove you by force.
We are not leaving.
The boarding announcement had just been made for Flight 447 to Atlanta when everything changed. A family of 4, dressed in their Sunday best for a wedding celebration, walked down the jet bridge with their carry-on bags and boarding passes in hand. They had no idea that in the next 20 minutes, their lives would be turned upside down, their dignity stripped away in front of hundreds of passengers, and their story would spark a national conversation that would reach the highest levels of corporate America and cost an airline millions of dollars. Before we dive into this incredible story that shook the aviation industry to its core, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because you definitely won't want to miss how this unfolds. Trust me, the ending will leave you speechless. The Johnson family had been looking forward to this trip for months. David Johnson, a 2-year-old engineering manager, his wife Sarah, a 8-year-old high school teacher, and their 2 children, one 4-year-old Maya and one 0-year-old Tyler, were heading to Atlanta for Sarah's cousin's wedding. They had saved up for this vacation, booked their flights well in advance, and even splurged on seats together in the premium economy section so the family could sit as a unit. David was the kind of father who always arrived at the airport 2 hours early, even for domestic flights. He checked in online the night before, printed boarding passes at home, and made sure everyone had their identification ready. Sarah had packed snacks for the kids and downloaded movies on her tablet to keep them entertained during the 3-hour flight. Maya, their teenager, was excited to see her extended family and had spent weeks picking out the perfect dress for the wedding ceremony. Tyler, their youngest, clutched his favorite travel pillow and was looking forward to his first time flying in almost 2 years. Nothing about this family suggested trouble. They were polite, well-dressed, and clearly prepared for their journey. David wore a crisp white dress shirt and dark slacks. Sarah had on a beautiful emerald green blouse and black pants. The children were dressed nicely but comfortably for travel. Their luggage met all size requirements. Their documentation was in order. They had arrived at the gate with plenty of time to spare. When the gate agent called for premium economy boarding, the Johnson family gathered their belongings and joined the line. They showed their boarding passes, walked down the jet bridge, and stepped onto the aircraft. The flight attendant at the door welcomed them with a smile and directed them toward their seats in row 12. That's when Airport Police Officer Kevin Bradley decided to make a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Officer Bradley had been working airport security for 6 years. He was stationed near the gate area when he noticed the Johnson family boarding the aircraft. Something about them caught his attention, though he would later struggle to articulate exactly what that something was. He radioed his supervisor and said he wanted to check on a situation developing on the plane. The Johnson family had just settled into their seats when Officer Bradley appeared in the aircraft doorway. He spoke briefly with the lead flight attendant, a woman named Jennifer Collins who had been with the airline for 12 years. What he told her would later become a central point of controversy in the legal proceedings that followed. According to Officer Bradley, he had received a report that passengers matching the Johnson family's description had been acting suspiciously in the terminal. He claimed there were concerns about their behavior and that he needed to question them before the flight could depart. Jennifer Collins later testified that she found this unusual, as she had personally greeted the family at the aircraft door and noticed nothing concerning about their demeanor or conduct. But Officer Bradley was insistent. He walked down the aisle to row 12, where the Johnson family was seated. David was helping Tyler buckle his seatbelt while Sarah was putting their carry-on bags in the overhead compartment. Maya was already seated by the window, looking out at the ground crew preparing the plane for departure. Officer Bradley stopped at their row and asked David Johnson to step into the aisle. David looked up, confused, and asked if there was a problem. Officer Bradley said he needed to speak with him privately and asked him to come to the front of the aircraft. David asked why, what this was about, and whether his family could stay seated while they sorted out whatever misunderstanding was occurring. That's when Officer Bradley made his second mistake of the day. He raised his voice loud enough for passengers in nearby rows to hear and said that the entire family needed to come with him immediately. He claimed they were being removed from the flight pending an investigation into suspicious activity. Sarah Johnson looked up from the overhead compartment, her face showing complete bewilderment. She asked what suspicious activity they were referring to. Maya looked frightened and asked her father what was happening. Tyler started to cry, not understanding why the police officer was talking to his parents in such a stern tone. David Johnson remained calm but firm. He asked Officer Bradley to explain specifically what they had allegedly done wrong. He pointed out that they had gone through security screening without incident, had valid boarding passes and identification, and had done nothing but board their assigned seats. He asked to speak with a supervisor. Officer Bradley's response was to call for backup. Within minutes, 2 additional airport police officers arrived on the aircraft. Passengers throughout the cabin began pulling out their cell phones. Some started recording video, sensing that something was seriously wrong with this situation. Flight attendant Jennifer Collins later said she felt increasingly uncomfortable but didn't know how to intervene without making the situation worse. The 3 officers surrounded the Johnson family's row. Officer Bradley repeated his demand that they leave the aircraft immediately. David asked again what they were accused of doing. The officers couldn't provide a clear answer. They mentioned suspicious behavior, but when pressed for details, they became vague and defensive. Sarah Johnson, who had remained quiet up to this point, finally spoke up. She told the officers that this was clearly a case of racial profiling and that she wanted the incident documented. She pulled out her phone and began recording. Officer Bradley immediately told her to put the phone away, but Sarah continued recording and stated clearly for the camera that her family was being removed from their flight without justification. Other passengers began speaking up. A man sitting across the aisle asked the officers what the family had done wrong. An elderly woman a few rows back called out that this was ridiculous and that the family should be left alone. A businessman in first class stood up and said he had seen the family in the gate area and they had done nothing suspicious. The pilots, Captain Robert Hayes and First Officer Lisa Park, became aware of the commotion and came to the passenger cabin to assess the situation. Captain Hayes had been flying for 23 years and had never seen anything quite like this. He asked Officer Bradley to explain the situation and was told there were security concerns that required the family's removal. Captain Hayes asked what specific security concerns existed. Officer Bradley said he couldn't discuss the details, but insisted the family had to leave. Captain Hayes looked at the Johnson family, looked at the 3 police officers, and made a decision that would later be praised by civil rights organizations across the country. He told Officer Bradley that unless he could articulate specific criminal activity or legitimate security threats, the family would not be removed from his aircraft. He said that as the pilot in command, he had the authority to determine who could and could not fly on his plane, and he saw no reason why the Johnson family should not be allowed to travel. This is where the situation escalated dramatically. Officer Bradley, now feeling challenged in front of dozens of witnesses and passengers recording video, made his 3rd and most costly mistake of the day. He told Captain Hayes that the family was being removed whether he liked it or not, and that if the captain interfered, he would be arrested as well. The entire passenger cabin fell silent. Everyone understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. A pilot standing up to police officers to protect passengers who were clearly being targeted unfairly. Captain Hayes calmly told Officer Bradley that he would not allow his passengers to be removed without proper justification, and that if the officers wanted to pursue this further, they could speak with airline management and federal aviation authorities on the ground. Officer Bradley's supervisor, Sergeant Michael Torres, finally arrived on the scene. Sergeant Torres had been with airport police for 15 years and immediately recognized that the situation had spiraled out of control. He spoke privately with Officer Bradley and the other officers, then approached Captain Hayes and the Johnson family. What happened next would become the turning point that transformed this from a local incident into a national scandal that would cost careers, millions of dollars, and forever change how airlines handle passenger disputes involving law enforcement. But before we get to that explosive confrontation and the shocking video that went viral within hours, I want to know what you think about this situation so far. Have you ever witnessed something like this while traveling? Type "witnessed" in the comments if you have, and let me know what you saw. The Johnson family's story was just beginning, and what happened next would prove that sometimes, when people stand up for what's right, justice can actually prevail. The tension in that aircraft cabin was about to reach a breaking point, and the decisions made in the next few minutes would change everything for everyone involved. Sergeant Torres approached the situation with the confidence of someone who thought he could quickly resolve what he saw as a minor misunderstanding. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Sergeant Torres walked up to Captain Hayes with the kind of swagger that comes from years of dealing with what he considered to be routine passenger disputes. He had handled hundreds of these situations before, and in his mind, this was just another case of someone making a big deal out of standard security procedures. He was confident he could smooth things over and get the flight back on schedule within minutes. He could not have been more wrong about what he was walking into. Torres introduced himself to Captain Hayes and suggested they step aside to discuss the situation privately. Captain Hayes declined, stating that whatever needed to be said could be said in front of the Johnson family, since they were the ones being affected by these actions. Torres looked around the cabin and seemed to notice for the first time just how many passengers were recording the interaction with their phones. He asked the passengers to stop filming, explaining that this was a security matter. Several passengers refused, pointing out that they were in a public space and had every right to document what was happening. One passenger, a lawyer traveling for business, loudly stated that citizens have the right to record police officers performing their duties. Torres turned his attention to the Johnson family, who remained seated in their row while this drama unfolded around them. He told them that there had been a misunderstanding and that if they would just come with him to answer a few questions, they could probably get this sorted out quickly and catch the next flight to Atlanta. Sarah Johnson had been recording the entire interaction on her phone. She looked directly at Sergeant Torres and asked him to explain on camera what specific crime or suspicious activity her family was accused of committing. Torres hesitated, glanced at Officer Bradley, and said they had received reports of concerning behavior in the terminal. David Johnson stood up in the aisle and faced Torres directly. He spoke in a clear, calm voice that carried throughout the cabin. He said his family had done nothing wrong, had committed no crimes, violated no regulations, and were not leaving this aircraft unless they were placed under arrest and told what charges they were facing. The confrontation was reaching a critical moment when something unexpected happened. Dr. Amanda Foster, a passenger sitting in first class, stood up and walked toward the back of the plane. Dr. Foster was a prominent civil rights attorney who had spent the last 15 years handling cases involving police misconduct and racial profiling. She had been quietly observing the situation and finally decided she needed to intervene. Dr. Foster approached Sergeant Torres and handed him her business card. She introduced herself and informed him that she was an attorney specializing in civil rights law. She told him that she had been watching the entire interaction and that what she was witnessing appeared to be a clear case of racial profiling and unlawful detention. Torres looked at the business card, then at Dr. Foster, then at the dozens of phone cameras pointed in his direction. For the first time since arriving on the aircraft, he seemed to understand that this situation had grown far beyond a simple passenger removal. Dr. Foster continued speaking in a clear, professional tone that everyone in the cabin could hear. She explained that the Johnson family had not been accused of any specific crime, had not been told what law they had violated, and were being detained without probable cause. She said that if the officers proceeded with removing the family without proper justification, they would be violating the family's constitutional rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments. The legal implications of what she was saying were not lost on Sergeant Torres. He had been through enough training to know that unlawful detention and civil rights violations could result in serious consequences for both him personally and the police department. But he was also in a difficult position because Officer Bradley had initiated this confrontation. Other officers were involved, and backing down now would be embarrassing. Torres made a decision that would prove to be just as costly as Bradley's original choice to target the family. Instead of de-escalating the situation, he doubled down. He told Dr. Foster that she needed to return to her seat and that this was police business. He said that the family was coming with them whether they liked it or not. That's when Captain Hayes stepped back into the conversation. He told Sergeant Torres that no passengers would be removed from his aircraft without proper legal justification. He said that as pilot in command, he had the final authority over who flew on his plane, and he was not authorizing the removal of the Johnson family. Torres responded by threatening to have the entire flight canceled and all passengers removed if Captain Hayes continued to interfere with police business. This threat backfired spectacularly. The other passengers, who had been watching this unfold with growing anger, began voicing their displeasure loudly. A businessman shouted that this was ridiculous and that the officers were clearly in the wrong. A mother traveling with her young children called out that she had been watching the Johnson family and they had done nothing suspicious. An elderly man said he had been flying for 60 years and had never seen anything so disgraceful in his life. The mood in the cabin was turning increasingly hostile toward the officers, and they could feel it. What had started as what Bradley thought would be a routine passenger interaction had become a public relations nightmare unfolding in real time in front of dozens of witnesses with cameras. Officer Bradley, who had remained largely quiet while his supervisor handled the situation, suddenly stepped forward and announced that the Johnson family was under arrest for interfering with airport security operations. This was his fourth and final mistake of the day, and it would prove to be the most expensive one of all. David Johnson immediately asked what law they had violated by sitting in their assigned seats. Officer Bradley couldn't provide a coherent answer. He began handcuffing David while Sarah continued recording and asking repeatedly what crime her husband was being charged with committing. The sight of David Johnson, a well-dressed father and husband, being handcuffed in front of his terrified children while seated on an airplane sent shockwaves through the cabin. Maya began crying and asking why they were hurting her father. Tyler was sobbing and clinging to his mother. Sarah was trying to comfort her children while continuing to document everything on her phone. Dr. Foster immediately announced that she was witnessing what appeared to be false arrest and imprisonment. She began dictating her observations into her own phone recording, creating a detailed legal record of everything she was seeing. Captain Hayes made the decision that would ultimately save his career and make him a hero to civil rights advocates nationwide. He announced to the cabin that he was calling federal aviation authorities and airline management to report what he described as the unlawful detention of passengers on his aircraft. He got on the aircraft's communication system and contacted air traffic control, requesting that federal aviation security personnel respond to his aircraft immediately. He stated that passengers were being unlawfully detained by local police and that he needed federal intervention. Within minutes, federal air marshals and TSA supervisors were boarding the aircraft. They found David Johnson handcuffed in the aisle, his wife recording while trying to comfort their crying children, 3 airport police officers unable to explain what crime had been committed, and an entire cabin full of angry passengers demanding that something be done about this obvious injustice. The federal officers immediately took control of the situation. They spoke with Captain Hayes, Dr. Foster, and several passengers who had witnessed the entire interaction from the beginning. They reviewed the video footage that multiple passengers had recorded. They questioned the airport police officers about what specific crime or security threat had justified their actions. When the federal officers couldn't get coherent answers from Bradley, Torres, and the other officers, they made a decision that shocked everyone involved. They ordered the airport police to release David Johnson immediately and informed them that they were the ones who would need to leave the aircraft. The federal officers apologized to the Johnson family on behalf of the airport and the aviation system. They assured them that what had happened was completely unacceptable and that there would be a full investigation. They offered to arrange alternative transportation if the family no longer felt comfortable flying. But David and Sarah decided they wanted to continue with their original travel plans. The airport police officers were escorted off the aircraft in front of all the passengers. As they walked down the aisle toward the door, several passengers called out comments about their conduct. Officer Bradley, in particular, looked humiliated and angry as he realized that his attempt to exert authority had backfired completely. But the real consequences for everyone involved were just beginning. As the aircraft finally prepared for departure, nearly 2 hours behind schedule, passengers were already uploading their videos to social media. The hashtags that would trend nationally were already being created. The news stories that would dominate headlines for weeks were already being written by passengers on their phones. The Johnson family had no idea that by the time their flight landed in Atlanta, their story would be viral, their videos would have millions of views, and their lives would be forever changed by what happened next. The airplane doors finally closed, and Flight 447 began its taxi to the runway. But the real journey for justice was just beginning, and it would take the Johnson family places they never expected to go. The flight to Atlanta was unlike any the Johnson family had ever experienced. Word had spread among the passengers about what they had just witnessed, and throughout the 3-hour journey, fellow travelers approached them to express their support and outrage. Flight attendants went out of their way to ensure the family was comfortable, bringing extra snacks for the children and checking on them frequently. Sarah kept her phone charged and continued documenting their experience, knowing instinctively that their story was far from over. Maya had stopped crying but remained shaken by seeing her father in handcuffs. Tyler kept asking why the police officers had been mean to them. David tried to maintain his composure for his children's sake, but inside he was furious about the humiliation his family had endured. Dr. Foster spent part of the flight speaking with the Johnson family about their legal options. She explained that what they had experienced appeared to be a clear-cut case of racial profiling and civil rights violations. She offered to help them find representation and warned them that the coming weeks would likely be intense as their story gained public attention. By the time Flight 447 touched down in Atlanta, the videos from the aircraft had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Passengers had been posting throughout the flight whenever the plane's Wi-Fi allowed, and the story was spreading rapidly across social media platforms. The Johnson family's phone started buzzing with notifications before they even reached the gate. News organizations were already reaching out for interviews. Civil rights groups were offering support. Legal firms were expressing interest in representing them. The hashtag Justice for Johnson Family was trending nationally. When they walked into the Atlanta terminal, they were met by Sarah's cousin Rebecca, who had come to pick them up. Rebecca had been following the story online and was shocked to learn that her family members were at the center of what was becoming a national controversy. The wedding they had come to Atlanta to attend was scheduled for the next day, but it was clear that their travel experience would overshadow the celebration. Family members gathered at Rebecca's house that evening, watching news coverage of the incident and trying to process what had happened. Meanwhile, back at the airport where their ordeal began, a firestorm was erupting. The videos showing David Johnson being handcuffed while his children cried had been viewed millions of times. News crews were stationed outside the airport demanding answers from police officials and airline executives. Officer Bradley found himself at the center of a national scandal. His name and face were being shared across the internet. His history of complaints and disciplinary actions was being investigated by journalists. His own family members were receiving angry messages from strangers who had seen the videos. Sergeant Torres was facing similar scrutiny. Internal affairs investigators were reviewing his decision-making during the incident. His supervisors were demanding explanations for why the situation had been allowed to escalate so dramatically. The airport police department was fielding hundreds of angry calls from the public. The airline was in full crisis management mode. Their corporate communications team was working around the clock to respond to the public outrage. Stock prices were dropping as investors worried about the long-term impact of the incident. Customer service departments were overwhelmed with complaints and cancellation requests. CEO Richard Hamilton had been pulled out of a board meeting to deal with what his staff described as a public relations catastrophe. He watched the videos in his office, surrounded by lawyers and communication specialists, and immediately understood that his company was facing a potential disaster that could take years to recover from. Hamilton made the decision to personally fly to Atlanta to meet with the Johnson family. This was unprecedented for a CEO of a major airline, but the situation demanded extraordinary measures. His legal team advised against it, warning that anything he said could be used against the company in future litigation. But Hamilton felt that a personal apology was necessary. The meeting took place at a downtown Atlanta hotel 2 days after the incident. Hamilton arrived with a small team of executives and lawyers. The Johnson family brought Dr. Foster and a local civil rights attorney who had offered to represent them. Hamilton began by offering a sincere apology to the family. He acknowledged that what had happened to them was completely unacceptable and that the airline bore responsibility for allowing airport police to remove paying customers without proper justification. He promised that changes would be made to prevent similar incidents in the future. David Johnson listened to the apology but made it clear that words alone would not be sufficient. He wanted accountability for the officers involved, policy changes at the airport, and compensation for the trauma his family had endured. He pointed out that his children were still having nightmares about seeing their father arrested. Sarah Johnson added that they wanted assurance that no other family would have to go through what they had experienced. She said the incident had shaken their faith in the justice system and made them question whether they were truly safe traveling in their own country. The legal negotiations that followed were complex and contentious. The Johnson family's attorneys documented the emotional trauma suffered by each family member. They gathered statements from the other passengers who had witnessed the incident. They reviewed airport security footage and communication records between police officers. The airline's legal team tried to argue that the company should not be held responsible for the actions of airport police officers who were not airline employees. But the Johnson family's lawyers countered that the airline had a duty to protect its passengers and had failed to intervene when law enforcement was clearly acting inappropriately. Federal investigators launched their own probe into the incident. The Department of Transportation opened an investigation into whether the airline had violated passenger rights regulations. The FBI began looking into potential civil rights violations by the airport police officers. Officer Bradley was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations. His personnel file revealed a pattern of complaints from minority travelers that had been inadequately addressed by his supervisors. Internal affairs investigators found evidence that he had been counseled multiple times about his interactions with passengers, but had received only minimal discipline. The airport police department's handling of previous complaints against Bradley became a major focus of the investigation. Records showed that 7 different passengers had filed complaints alleging racial profiling over the past 3 years. All of these complaints had been dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary actions. Community leaders and civil rights organizations rallied around the Johnson family. Protest demonstrations were organized at the airport, demanding justice and policy reforms. Religious leaders called for boycotts of the airline until meaningful changes were implemented. The story continued to dominate news coverage for weeks. Television networks interviewed aviation experts, civil rights attorneys, and former airline employees about the broader issues raised by the incident. Editorial boards across the country published opinion pieces calling for better training and oversight of airport security personnel. The Johnson family found themselves thrust into the spotlight as reluctant spokespersons for airline passenger rights. They gave carefully controlled interviews, always emphasizing that they wanted their experience to lead to positive changes that would protect other families. Maya and Tyler struggled with the sudden attention. Their school classmates had seen the videos online, and they faced a mixture of sympathy and unwanted curiosity about their experience. The family decided to work with counselors to help the children process the trauma they had experienced. As the legal proceedings dragged on for months, more victims of similar incidents began coming forward. The Johnson family's case had opened the floodgates for other passengers who had experienced racial profiling but had previously felt powerless to challenge it. The investigation revealed systemic problems that went far beyond one incident with one family. Training records showed that airport police officers received minimal instruction on passenger rights and racial bias. Complaint procedures were inadequate and often discouraged passengers from filing formal reports. The pressure on the airline and airport authorities continued to mount as the story refused to fade from public attention. Stock analysts were warning that the company's reputation might never fully recover unless dramatic action was taken to address the underlying issues that had led to the Johnson family's treatment. What happened next would set precedents for how airlines handle passenger rights violations and would result in one of the largest settlements in aviation history. The Johnson family's fight for justice was about to reach its climactic conclusion, and the outcome would send shockwaves throughout the entire airline industry. The pressure reached a breaking point when Congress announced they would be holding hearings on airline passenger rights and airport security practices. The House Transportation Committee scheduled hearings specifically focused on racial profiling in aviation, with the Johnson family incident as the centerpiece of their investigation. Committee Chairman Robert Stevens had been following the case closely and was appalled by what he had seen in the videos. He issued subpoenas for airline executives, airport police officials, and federal aviation authorities to testify about their policies and procedures for handling passenger disputes. The announcement of congressional hearings sent panic through the airline's corporate headquarters. Legal teams worked frantically to prepare executives for what promised to be a grueling public examination of company policies. The stock price dropped another 15% as investors realized the scope of scrutiny the company would face. Officer Bradley's situation deteriorated rapidly as the federal investigation expanded. FBI agents discovered that he had been using his position to target minority passengers systematically, often conducting unnecessary searches and detentions that followed a clear racial pattern. His text messages with other officers revealed conversations that contained explicitly racist language and jokes about harassing certain types of passengers. The Department of Justice announced they were considering federal civil rights charges against Bradley and potentially other officers involved in the incident. This raised the stakes dramatically, as federal charges could result in significant prison time rather than just administrative discipline or job loss. Sergeant Torres found himself under investigation not just for his role in the Johnson family incident, but for his failure to properly supervise Bradley despite years of complaints. Internal documents revealed that Torres had received multiple reports about Bradley's conduct, but had consistently minimized or dismissed them without proper investigation. The airline's insurance company began pressuring executives to settle the case quickly before the congressional hearings could inflict further damage on the company's reputation. Insurance adjusters calculated that the potential cost of ongoing litigation, combined with the impact on bookings and stock price, could exceed $50 million if the case dragged on much longer. CEO Hamilton found himself fighting for his own job as board members questioned whether he could effectively lead the company through this crisis. Emergency board meetings were called to discuss potential leadership changes and damage control strategies. Hamilton's 20-year career with the company was suddenly in jeopardy. The Johnson family's legal team had grown to include some of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country. They filed additional lawsuits against the airport authority, the police department, and individual officers involved in the incident. The legal strategy was to pursue maximum accountability and financial consequences for everyone who had played a role in the family's mistreatment. Public pressure continued to intensify as celebrity supporters began speaking out about the case. Professional athletes, entertainers, and political figures shared the videos and called for justice. The hashtag associated with the family's case was trending globally, bringing international attention to issues of racial profiling in American aviation. Airport employee unions began distancing themselves from the officers involved, stating that racial profiling violated their values and professional standards. Some airport workers came forward anonymously to report additional incidents of inappropriate conduct by Bradley and other officers that had previously gone unreported. The airline implemented immediate policy changes in an attempt to demonstrate good faith to investigators and the public. They announced new training programs for all employees on passenger rights and cultural sensitivity. They established a passenger advocate office to handle complaints about discriminatory treatment. They revised their contracts with airport police to include specific provisions about racial profiling, but these changes were seen by many as too little, too late. Civil rights organizations argued that cosmetic policy adjustments could not undo the systemic problems that had allowed the Johnson family's mistreatment to occur. They demanded fundamental restructuring of how airlines and airports handle passenger disputes involving law enforcement. 15 months after that fateful boarding call for Flight 447, the Johnson family stood before a federal courthouse as their attorneys announced a historic $4.5 million settlement. Officer Bradley had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations. Sergeant Torres was terminated and faced his own criminal charges. The airline implemented sweeping policy reforms and established a $20 million fund for passenger rights advocacy. But perhaps the most important victory was the precedent set for future cases. The Johnson family's courage to stand up against injustice had created new protections for travelers nationwide. Airlines could no longer hide behind police authority when passengers were mistreated. Airport officers faced real consequences for racial profiling. And most importantly, other families would never have to endure what the Johnsons experienced that day. David Johnson, speaking on the courthouse steps, said their fight had never been about money. It was about dignity, accountability, and making sure no child would ever have to watch their parent being handcuffed for the crime of flying while black. The ripple effects continue today. New federal regulations require enhanced training for all airport security personnel. Passenger Bill of Rights legislation has been strengthened, and dozens of similar cases have been successfully prosecuted using the legal precedents established by this landmark settlement. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, extraordinary change can happen. The Johnson family proved that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's scary, can create a better world for everyone who comes after. If you think this situation was bad, wait until you see what happens in the case on the right-hand side.